There's somebody in my world that I could send them, anything and they won't watch it. Okay?
We all know this person.
But that person's watching the NCI, and other people are telling me the same thing. Like, so the format is somehow safe. For whatever reason, there are some people that will not watch anything else, but they will watch the National Citizens Inquiry. So somehow we've found a formula that for part of the group that just will not accept anything is was willing to watch.
Welcome to Meet Me in the Middle. My guest today is Shawn Buckley, a brilliant lawyer whose focus is on protecting charter rights and testing the constitutional validity of legislation. He's been in private practice since 1995, practicing in the areas of criminal and regulatory law. Shawn has extensive expertise in Health Canada litigation in defending regulatory charges under the Food and Drug Act in the areas of natural health products. Most of these cases involved a constitutional challenge. Shawn Buckley has been an expert witness for committees in both the Senate and the House of Commons. He lectures concerning the regulation of natural health products by diverse groups such as the Fraser Institute, practitioner groups, consumer groups, and the NHPPA. He was also invited to draft the Charter of Health Freedom. Before entering private practice, Shawn worked for the BC Human Rights Council, the then nonpartisan Intergovernmental Affairs branch of the Premier's office, and also Transport Canada. All of this experience in government has given him valuable insight in dealing with bureaucracy. Shawn is currently the lead lawyer traveling around Canada with the National Citizens Inquiry, or the NCI. Shawn, welcome. I had the privilege of testifying at the National Citizens Inquiry when you were in Toronto. And I'm certain that people across Canada are very appreciative of what you and the rest of the people supporting the NCI have been doing. And, the first obvious question is for you is, what is the National Citizens Inquiry and why is it important?
Yeah, and it's just I'm smiling because that's becoming a harder and harder question to answer. So I don't know if you know, there was a group of us, we put on what was called the Citizens Hearing. And so you just go to citizenshearing.ca. And that was just 3 days of hearing without lawyers and without prepping witnesses, just having people come and say their piece. And the idea there was just to show that there is a different narrative to the mainstream government narrative. But after that, a couple of other groups joined us, and with the idea of, well, let's do an independent inquiry. Like, the government's not going to do it, so let's try and structure this best we can to mirror what a government inquiry would look like, and march these commissioners across the land without any idea at all of how large of an undertaking that was. So we just started last summer. And the crazy thing is now we've been in 6 cities, and I'm going to Quebec City in 2 days, and then Ottawa after that. So we have got this small little core group that's, okay, well, let's hear, how we're going to structure and all of that. But then when it got down to actually doing things, we just looked for volunteers. Like, okay, so we need to select commissioners. Well, who wants to volunteer to be on that committee and this? And now, I'm pretty involved. So as far as, people that were in the initial group goes, I probably know as much as most. And I bet you I know 30% of the people that are the NCI, because there's whole teams of volunteers that have just been tasked to do their own thing. And so it's kind of hard to describe what the NCI is. So I think the NCI started as this idea of, let's have an independent inquiry to get down to the truth and come up with positive recommendations and allow people to have a voice. I'm not sure what it is going forward, because so many people have been inspired by this. And so many people are saying, I feel hopeful again. I feel even just the ability to get involved and do something is empowering. Like, so whether it's with the NCI or other groups, like I think people are realizing they're at this point where they can't just sit down. So I don't know where this goes. I think that there's some momentum and we have to figure out together what that looks like. But as far as the NCI, I think my best answer is now it started as marching commissioners across the land, and now I don't know what it is because a whole bunch of people are doing their own thing, and I think that's more important than anything this little group could do. So I wish I could be more specific. I just don't know that I can.
Yeah, and when I testified as well in March, I was asked by Tamara Ugolini. I was interviewed right after my testimony, and she asked me a similar question. It's not a straightforward
Mm-mm.
thing to answer, and in a sense, it's about it, because it's necessary, because it is something that we can do, and because it is the right thing to do. But I want to ask, I want to talk more about you as well, specifically, is why did you get involved with this? Why specifically this, and why did you feel
Well,
moved to get involved?
actually, so I have to thank people like you because it's funny when COVID started, I was getting call after call after call at the law office. It's like, well, you've got to start this lawsuit and you've got to do this. And have you ever had a feeling that you're not supposed to do something? And the
Hmm.
problem is, at that time, my firm was quite small. If I was to take on a couple of constitutional cases, it can just totally eat your time. And I just felt that's not what I was supposed to do. I was supposed to wait. And so it's interesting now when there's just been some fantastic lawyers in the trenches that have just been doing a ton of great work. Um, and work that needed to be done. And these people are champions, the James Kitchens and Leighton Grays of the world. So, but really nothing came of it except to expose to us all that the courts weren't really going to solve our problems.
Hmm.
So, yeah, so I was getting frustrated and have to admit that I was afraid in my little corner. And then those truckers. They started, they
Oh, I
started
know.
driving,
Yeah, those
and
truckers.
people started lining up along the way and on the bridges, and that woke something up inside of me. And I just decided I could no longer. So isn't it interesting? Is just those people would have had no idea the impact because how many people like me are there that they
Hmm.
inspired, and there's all these little things happening that collectively can add up. We just owe a debt of gratitude. So yeah, so I just decided I needed to get involved. I actually was started a group called Citizens Investigation Services Canada. I was pulling
Hmm.
lawyers and retired police officers together was the plan to start doing investigations and documenting potential crimes connected with COVID. And when you
Hmm.
start a little group, you start discovering other groups and you start liaising. And before I knew it, I was involved in the citizens hearings. And then I became involved in the NCI, which has just totally eaten my time so that other projects literally been on hold. And here I am.
Well, it's incredible to me because I do remember what life was like about a year and a half to 2 years ago. And I had this maybe naive sense of justice or what it was supposed to be. And I've said this publicly many times that, in the early days when the government was doing stuff that they were doing, I had this belief that no, the law enforcement and the lawyers are going to step in and intervene and put a stop to
Mhm.
this. And that never happened. Uh, and then, fast forward into the future, we've got the COVID experimental injection. And I thought, okay, the doctors are going to intervene.
Mhm.
And we sat and waited, and they didn't. So, from a lawyer's perspective, somebody, in high regard within society, and I'm going to forego any of the lawyer jokes and sawbones and all that kind of stuff, right, about lawyers, because a lot of my friends have, in the last year and a half, have become lawyers. Um, there's a divide. I mean, there's a divide across Canada, and it's huge.
Hmm.
But would you say that there's a divide amongst lawyers across Canada as well?
No, I
And if
actually think
so, you don't.
I think I think that lawyers as a group bought into the COVID narrative more than other groups,
Mm,
and the courts totally fell in line. And we had one judge on this, a retired judge on the stand in Winnipeg, and he had a pretty good point. He said, look at the demographics of the judges. Like most of them are older,
hmm.
and they're not. I mean, they're living in the same culture as the rest of us, and so we're getting all this fear, fear, fear. And there's not a single institution outside of the court standing up and saying, no, this is wrong. So if you buy into the narrative and you're in that demographics that actually COVID is dangerous for, I mean, it's still, you know,
Right.
really not worse than a bad influenza season. But, these, I think they got scared. And then, when they're imposing all this masking in that, like I, we have to participate in, professional development hours. I have to do 12 hours each year to keep my license to practice. And it's just amazing how COVID would come up everywhere. And it's like, you just have to bite your tongue because you're the only one in the group that thinks differently. So I'm very disappointed. And I think we have to understand, and I said this in one of the openings at one of the NCI hearings, is a professional Department of Justice long term is inconsistent with a liberal Western democracy. And we basically, the Department of Justice has been this machine with almost unlimited resources compared to the defense bar that just is always there arguing en masse to restrict our rights, restrict our rights, restrict our rights, allow the state to intrude more and more and more. And like it's just been this slow grind, but it has become so pro-state. And it was why I was reluctant to get involved in the litigation. I knew it wouldn't end well, that it
Hmm.
would just be a waste of time. And it wasn't a waste of time because it showed us it showed the truth,
Hmm.
right?
What you're alluding to is this kind of the justification for so many courts accepting judicial notice, as opposed to actually doing a deep dive on a lot of the evidence that was coming from Health Canada or health departments across the country.
Tom, I am shocked at how far it went. Like so, and just so your listeners know, so judicial notice is where a court doesn't need proof of something, that they can just without evidence being led in front of them say, okay, this is such a well-known fact that we're just going to accept it. So when it rains, the lawn gets wet, so to speak. We don't need to call somebody to explain that to us. But you know the fact that, and I have to talk about that Ontario Court of Appeal decision, and then I'll just explain that it went further. But so the worst case in my mind is this Ontario Court of Appeal. It's CG versus JH. If anyone wants to look it up on Canley, the citation would be 2023 ONCA 77. And it started in the lower court where we had two parents duking it out over vaccination. The father wanted to get the COVID jab for the kids, and the mother didn't. And the mother, has some internet printouts, maybe of Dr. Malone and whatever, and the father has like the Health Canada printouts. And the lower court judge said, well, you know, it's okay to ask questions, and I'm really not sure, and I'm not granting the father the right to make this decision. So, and it's funny, he was unrepresented, but then in the Ontario Court of Appeal, I think there's three lawyers acting for him, if I recall correctly, which is funny, who was financing that. And the Ontario Court of Appeal basically directed the lower courts, no, you take judicial notice. You don't need anyone to lead evidence of the fact that when Health Canada approves a vaccine, that's basically evidence that it's proven to be safe and proven to be effective. So now the danger about that is that, I mean, I thought before that the court was supposed to basically be between the state and the citizen, and it
Hmm.
doesn't matter if the state takes you to court or you take the state to court. Both sides have to prove their point, not just accept what public health authorities say. But the irony about this Ontario Court of Appeal decision is, so here they're saying, well, the fact that Health Canada approved these vaccines is proof that they're safe and effective. And I'm thinking, they didn't actually look into the law. So they're basically asking lower courts to take judicial notice of a ghost,
Hmm.
because our regular drug approval laws, you have to prove safety and efficacy. And then once you've established something safe and you've established it's effective, when these are, safety is kind of a sliding scale and so is effective, then and only then do you do a cost benefit analysis. Do the benefits outweigh the risks? But for these COVID-19 vaccines, that test didn't apply. So I think it was in March of 2020, about a month before Pfizer and Moderna filed their applications, the minister comes out with this interim order exempting COVID-19 vaccines from having to prove safety and efficacy, and gave this other test. And the other test, this may be a direct quote. So the minister has sufficient evidence to support the conclusion, and I'll just stop there. The minister is Health Canada. And
Hmm.
if you're supposed to prove something to Health Canada, it should read the minister, so Health Canada has sufficient evidence to conclude. But it doesn't say that. It says Health Canada has sufficient evidence to support the conclusion. So basically, there's an argument that the benefits of the new drug outweigh the risk, having regards to the uncertainties concerning the benefits and risks and the urgent public health emergency presented by COVID-19. The word safety isn't mentioned in that test. The word efficacy is not mentioned in this test. So here these vaccines are approved under a test where not only does safety and efficacy not have to be proven, but those words aren't even in the test. And we're not here to deconstruct the test, but you actually don't even have to prove the benefits outweigh the risks. You don't have to prove anything really. So I just found it interesting that the Ontario Court of Appeal is directing lower courts to take judicial notice of something that doesn't exist. And getting back to your question, I'm shocked. I'm shocked at how much the courts gave deference to the state, because how do you get address for any rights if
Hmm.
the courts are basically going to take the state's side and not require the state to prove?
It amazes me when we look at the deliberate separation of powers. I mean, this is kind of a fundamental thing that we have in democratic societies, is that there are checks and balances. They are separated specifically to facilitate checks and balances.
Hmm.
But like you said, when you're having the courts give deference to the government, and I do plan in the future to do a much deeper dive with Keith Wilson, because he had an opportunity to cross-examine all of the people, the key people from Health Canada that were making these decisions and authorizing it, and what their backgrounds are. And so in the future, I do plan on coming back and really going deep into that, because he was on Brian Peckford's
Hmm.
charter challenge for Section 6 of the charter, which is mobility rights, where the courts found it moot only because the government suspended it. They didn't actually terminate their mandates, they suspended it, but the courts found that it was moot. I find that, could you imagine being the judge who the next morning has to go into court and face Brian Peckford, the guy who was one of the last living members who wrote the bloody charter? You've now got to go in and say, yeah, what you wrote doesn't actually apply, or what you signed,
Yeah.
brought into law into this country. You're wrong. I'm right. 40 years later, I interpret what you helped draft a different way, right? Could you imagine what it would be like for that judge the next day? But it apparently didn't seem to matter who that judge was facing off with. They still determined that it was moot. And what's interesting is I'm hearing talks that at the Liberal convention a few days ago, One of the platform policies they're talking about is actually mandating the experimental injection again
I
across
heard
Canada.
that.
So, what is this judge going to do? Because this was one of the arguments that Keith made, was that it's not moot because it was only suspended.
Hmm.
The door is wide open for the government to bring it back. So it is still wide open. So therefore it can't be moot. But anyway, getting off topic a little bit on that issue, but I do find the, you know, judicial notice to be a very bizarre thing that happened in this country. I have
Well,
another question too.
you're raising mootness also, I think, should be explained.
Hmm.
So and Keith and Eva, I mean, they did fantastic work too. I shouldn't fail to mention their names. But just so your audience understands, so what the issue of mootness was or is so, let's take Brian Peckford as a perfect example, but it applied not just to Brian Peckford. There were other people, challenging, restrictions on the right to assemble outside, and all of this. We had case after case after case where you start the court case, you filed your affidavits, the government files their affidavits, and everyone spends all this time and energy cross-examining the people on their affidavits, and they're preparing their arguments, and they're getting close to being able to have their day in court, and then the government drops the mandate.
Hmm.
And then the Crown applies, this Department of Justice applies, and that's, in my mind, become a totally Orwellian term. So the
Hmm.
Department of Justice makes their application to have your case thrown out as moot, and the argument is well, look at, there's no longer restrictions, so we really can't grant you a remedy. And the court agrees, and case after case after case is thrown out as moot. When the remedy is, we want to know, was this legal, so that the next time the government can't do it again. And I'm ashamed to
Hmm.
be a member of the bar with what has happened. I have personal shame. It was kind of a new low. And you mentioned Keith, cross-examining the Health Canada person. That was Celia Lorenko that approved all the
Hmm.
vaccines.
Yes.
And I think she's going to be, fairly upset with some of the things she put in that affidavit and said on cross-examination. I think every Canadian should read it, and you'd be shocked,
Hmm.
at how these things got approved.
Yeah, it's funny about the Justice Department. I now refer to it as the Justin Department. Because we squared off with these guys during the Public Order Emergency Commission. There
Hmm.
was 25 of them, and there was 4 lawyers representing us. And Keith was prevented from actually being involved because he was subpoenaed as a witness. So of the 4 lawyers we had, 3 were kind of only had sort of any standing in the commission themselves. So it was kind of funny to see the size of the Justin Department and the number of lawyers they had and the dirty tricks that they were playing. And, from my point of view, I make no mistake that it's not about protecting the people of Canada. It's not justice for Canadians. It's protecting the Prime Minister's office from that's what my takeaway from that whole entire experience was. So, you know, getting back to the NCI, did you ever think that the citizens would be moved or inspired or even motivated, I guess is a better term, to conduct a citizens-led, citizen-funded public inquiry into the actions of their own government? Did you ever think that would happen in a place like Canada?
Well, that it would need to happen. So, I
Hmm.
mean, there's kind of 2 ways I could answer that. Because if you're just asking, generally, would I ever thought that there would actually be a need for citizens to inquire? No, no, not really. And one thing that we've learned with this experience, because we only now have 2 more weeks and we're finished our 8 cities. And we were having a meeting earlier today. We have 800 people waiting in line. These are just lay witnesses right now wanting to testify, and we have to give them a voice. So
Hmm.
going forward, we're gonna have to continue somehow, whether that's virtually or whatever. I guess we're gonna need input from Canadians as to what to do, and others are asking. They're saying, well, we need to like look into specific things. I mean, even just
Mhm.
how the media handled this and a separate inquiry just into media actions, for example. So I think that Canadians are going to be inquiring into their government for quite some time because it's the only way we're actually going to get truth, isn't it?
Well, we
So
certainly won't from the media.
yeah, or government inquiries, right?
Hmm.
I've been shocked by some of the evidence, like just totally shocked. And I thought I had a pretty good grasp on what had happened.
Good, because I want to get into that. But we'll just get through a couple more questions that I have for you, and I want to actually talk more about your career, and I think that's why I want to kind of get into the things that you've heard, the things that you've seen. But I want to talk a little bit about you in your early days in your career. Um, and I'm fascinated why what it is that drive people to go into a profession that they choose. And talking with Keith Wilson and Eva, I was shocked at the actual number of lawyers that don't make it past the 5-year mark as professional lawyers. I was shocked by that. Like it's a huge percentage. I don't know the number, but it's a huge percentage of lawyers that 5 years after passing the bar are no longer practicing lawyers. But your career has been pretty interesting in terms of, you've got a breadth of experience as a lawyer. But I'm interested to know what motivated you to become a lawyer to begin with.
Well, I never, I never planned for being a lawyer. So when I went to law school, I had no intention of being a lawyer. Actually, I wanted to be a university professor. Um, but circumstances conspired. So by the time I graduated from law school, I had 10 years of university under my belt and a 2-year-old to feed. So I thought, well, I'll practice law for a little while. And but my passion had always been in the Constitution. So I'd gone into law school to study constitutional law,
Mhm.
and it had been a focus in my undergraduate also. And if you're going to go into constitutional law, you end up doing a lot of criminal law because a lot of the charter rights only interface, where the state wheel is hitting the road, so to speak,
Mhm.
in the criminal justice system. And in my case, it also brought me into health law because the Constitution interacts quite a bit with, the question of what do we have the right to access treatments that the government doesn't want us to have. And I kind of fell into that too. So, but it's funny, you're forced to take a criminal law class in your first year of law school. And when they started talking about the role of defense counsel, how, basically you're there to make sure the trial is fair. And it just resonated with me.
Mhm.
Like, and it's funny, like the public doesn't like defense counsel. And, you know, let's say you fly to Mexico tomorrow and you rent a car and you're pulled over for speeding. And the two cops are walking up to the car with their hands on their guns. You feel
Mhm.
you're worried about going into jail. And why is that? Because they don't have the rule of law. But, in Canada pre-COVID, you get pulled over for speeding and the officer's walking up to the car, you feel like you're being taxed. You're upset because you're paying
Yeah.
a road tax,
Yeah.
literally. And that's because of defense counsel. They're the ones that define how far the state can go in interacting with your life. So
Mhm.
yeah, so I basically just devoted my career to trying to, I mean, as I say, slow down the machine.
Mhm.
And anyone, I'm working on my 29th year practice. Anyone that's been doing that as long as I have, will tell you it's just been soul sucking because just slowly they gain more and more ground. You're fighting a rearguard action against a large army, and
Mhm.
I mean, you're talking about how
Yeah.
unfair the Rouleau Commission was. I mean,
Mhm.
right down to procedurally, like didn't even only get like 15 minutes to cross-examine
Was
the witness.
10. It was
Like,
10.
and it should have been days, right? Like if
Mhm.
you to be, to be fair.
Mhm.
And you're always against the machine. I had one case um, where we were basically asking the federal court for a declaration that when the states basically seizes vital medication, like so stuff that really is life and death, and in that case,
Mhm.
the state caused death after death after death, that is a constitutional minimum. Maybe the state should tell you they've seized your medication and that there should be some mechanism for you to be able to argue that your life is more important than some regulation being violated.
Mhm.
And I think that there were 12 lawyers against me in that case. Like it's just, and those are the ones you see,
Mhm.
not the team behind them.
Right, right. Um, I was having a good conversation with Keith Wilson the other day, and he was explaining to me that. So let me back up a little bit. After I finished my master's degree in business, I'd actually considered doing a law degree to see if I could get in and become a lawyer. But
Hmm.
I was kind of perplexed, like what area of law would I want to study? So I thought, do I want to go into criminal law? And I immediately said no. I thought if I go into criminal law and I end up putting away somebody who's innocent, that's terrifying. If
Hmm.
I get somebody off who's guilty, that's equally terrifying to me as well. And then I thought, okay, well, what about real estate law? That looked beyond boring for me. And I thought, okay, is there civil law? Is there, corporate? And I thought there's all these different areas of law. Fast forward into the future, and I'm looking at all this law and I'm thinking, wow, constitutional law seems really interesting. But Keith Wilson described it as a Venn diagram between criminal law and civil law. And that intersection, that small oval shaped intersection between the two areas, that's constitutional law. And so like what you're saying about, you know, being involved in constitutional cases, yeah, you're going to have to be involved with it. It's not just going after the government for violating charter rights, because typically that seems to happen when law enforcement are involved in making an arrest, that there's some or charges are being laid. It's usually, you know, law enforcement somehow it turns into something that appears to be criminal first and foremost. And something I didn't know until all this COVID stuff happened. I didn't know this, and I was surprised because a lot of people out there I've spoken to don't know this either. You cannot bring a charter challenge or you can't make a claim against the charter to a private organization. The charter is meant to protect the public from the actions of the government or agents of the government. You
Hmm.
can't sue Tim Hortons for violating your charter rights or McDonald's.
No, you have to go
Um,
under provincial human rights legislation.
yeah, and I thought that was fascinating. That it's nuanced, but the vast majority of people I don't think realize it. I certainly didn't either. Before COVID gave me my crash course in law, um, but it's interesting to me. I'm 50 years old, so I don't plan on ever going back to law school. And, by the time a law firm would let me take my training wheels off, I'd be 60. So I'm not, I'm not going down that road. Maybe if I was 10 years younger, I would have considered it. But, constitutional law, I think my prediction is in the future is going to be, um, let's say, is it going to be on the rise, or is it going to be sort of the new area of law that gets an enormous amount of new attention? And I'm kind of curious to know what you think about new lawyers coming into the system. Should they focus on constitutional law right now in this day and age?
Boy, that's a good question because I mean, as as
An
a senior
exhausted lawyer.
no, but I mean, if you were to come into my office and have a pretty good charter violation, I would discourage you from proceeding. And
Hmm.
I would discourage you for several reasons. Is first the way the Department of Justice will handle it. So I mean, even pre-COVID, when we still believed that you could win the odd case, there's this playbook to basically exhaust you of resources and exhaust you mentally and emotionally and in every way they can. It's like ACID system. What's the term I'm looking for? Um, but basically, they're coming at you from every angle. So
Mm.
the rule of law is just basically the principle that, the government and the citizen, everyone, it doesn't matter who you are, you're treated equally. And it doesn't work if one side has all the resources and the other doesn't. And it's one of the reasons why I say that, a professional Department of Justice isn't compatible with the rule of law. But if the government actually wanted courts to adjudicate, when you would start an action against the government, be it just a regular, you're suing for something, or you're seeking constitutional remedy, you'd think they would agree on everything that doesn't really matter. Like, let's focus it, and then let's not bring motion after motion to exhaust. Let's just get there quickly. And they do the opposite. They just exhaust you. I'm the number of cases that don't actually get to trial, I think, are astounding. So, yeah. So as far as junior lawyers, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think the charter's dead. It lasted 40 years and it's dead. It's flawed. Section 1 is is an insurmountable flaw. And so, just so your viewers understand, so we have these rights in our charter, but Section 1 allows the court to exempt the government even if you've shown the rights have been violated. And Section 1 reads, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in it. Now, that's the good part. But then it carries on and says, subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. And what this clause has allowed is, you go to court and the court agrees, yes, the government has violated your charter right. And this has happened in those few COVID cases that actually got to argue they were not thrown out for mootness or exhausted for other reasons. And the court says, yeah, your rights were violated, but the government was justified in doing it. Mm-hmm. So basically agrees your right was violated, but says it's okay. And that is a flawed section. But yet our Constitution, which is just a British statute, the mechanism for amending our Constitution, we will never, ever in 1,000 years succeed in amending our Constitution. So we're in a bind.
And the very first time I read the charter, the words demonstrably justified jumped off the page at me. Like, they literally screamed at me. And I thought, okay, that's maybe a good thing. But my second thought to this is, who is the arbiter of truth in that particular case when you say demonstrably justify? But who judges whether it's demonstrably justified? Because that is now a very subjective endeavor, potentially. And I think it's meant to maybe sound like it is objective. But to me, it's kind of I hate to say a throwaway or a cop-out sentence.
Well, you are raising something really important, because you're basically questioning this section. And I wonder if the problem is with the wording, or basically the way our courts are set up. Because why Section 1 went in there is okay, so here this is new. This charter rights, constitutional, they're going to be supreme over every other law. And but at the end of the day, who should be making the final decision on a rights issue? Should it be unelected judges, or should it be elected politicians? And there's not a right answer, Tom. Mm-hmm. Like, there's not a right answer. And I wonder if, the decision that, in some cases, the state could be justified. Like, let's say we had a 1918 flu, mm-hmm. where, 10% of the population was going to die. And let's say some measures that, would restrict our freedoms actually would be meaningful. Should we have rights bending there? Like, I mean, philosophically, I think the bigger problem is that the courts didn't act independently, and the question is why and how do we restructure the court system? But to
Mhm.
say that we should just have absolute rights, at the end of the day, then we're going to have judges making exceptions because you're going to have fact situations where that's not reasonable. Like
But
you can't
it's
win either way.
what's interesting to me is if I understand this correctly, because I've talked to Premier Peckford about this specific
Mhm.
issue, and there are certain sections within the charter that are exempt from what it says in section 1, and specifically section 6 is mentioned in section 33 of the charter
Yeah, you're
to
referring to the
that
notwithstanding clause, section
notwithstanding,
33, not
yeah,
section 1.
right, exactly. So this is where it does get confusing, right? Because I've watched Suits, I've watched Law and Order, and I live with Keith Wilson, but I did not go to law school. So you can imagine an ordinary citizen who's trying to look at this, what it is your rights. It's not overly obvious. Like it does. It's very difficult. I would imagine it was written by lawyers. Um, you know, Speaking of which, Brian Peckford also claimed he doesn't know who wrote Section 1. That in itself seems to be a little bit of a mystery. A lot of people out there have no idea who actually drafted Section 1 of the Charter. Maybe you know the answer. I don't know, but I
No,
know I've
no,
seen interviews.
no.
Nobody
I
knows.
don't. I expect it was some DOJ lawyer or some, you know,
Hmm.
lawyer brought in for that purpose, right? And I mean, we do know that there was a lot of debate over that section because again, it's
Hmm.
who at the end of the day has the final say. Elected politicians or the judges. Now, when
Hmm.
it's the elected politicians that are getting to decide who has the say, you're going to end up with the section 1. Now,
Right. Yeah,
so
because when I talked to Brian Peckford about this, he said, like, look, we even considered a pandemic. There were certain sections of the charter that we wanted to not be entangled because of the notwithstanding clause. They said specifically, even under a pandemic, they believed at the time that a pandemic was not a justification to suspend Section 6 of the Charter and some of the other ones that are mentioned in 33. But it's funny because you talk about the notwithstanding being separate from Section 1, but it almost, am I interpreting this correctly that one kind of overrules the other regardless?
well, yeah. So just so your viewers know, so I mean, we talked about section 1, how you can prove to a court your rights been violated, and yet the court will say, well, too bad, so sad, the government
Mhm.
was justified in doing this. But section 33 is a total different kettle of fish. So the government can pass a law that clearly violates and is intended to violate some of your charter rights. Some they can, and some they can't. And
Mhm.
it's called the notwithstanding clause. So literally, notwithstanding that you've got this right, we're passing this law, but you have to repass the law every 5 years.
Mhm.
It will expire, and it doesn't apply to every right. And again, that's the politicians just deciding that they needed to have a little more power than they wanted. But I mean, you could philosophically even ask the question, how is it that this group of premiers and the prime minister get to decide what rights we have and how they're arbitrated? I mean, which
Mhm.
is even a deeper question.
Yeah.
So that you know I think going forward, um, the problem is always the philosophical assumptions underpinning your society, and our constitution is based on and read the whole thing, start with the B&A Act, you'll be shocked, you'll never call us
Mhm.
a democracy again. um, but I mean, it's basically premised on the fact that you don't have rights. Somebody else gets to choose, and then you don't have rights. So either Parliament or the legislature can take them away under Section 33, or a court can say you don't have them. And so if
And I've heard this argument several times from people that I've met in the last year. When I was campaigning, I actually ran with the Ontario Party for provincial politics, and this is something I heard. I mean, I heard arguments for and against the Bill of Rights, the Charter, And a common theme amongst people who advocate strongly for the Bill of Rights is that, you know, God gives you your rights, or your rights cannot be given to you by man. And, this is in line with what you're talking about philosophically, is that who gives themselves the authority to bestow rights onto the rest of the population? Because, a lot of people believe, hey, I'm a free person. I was born this way, and nobody should have the right, ironically, to tell me what my rights are. So, I mean, we can get into some really sophisticated
Some
circular
deep, deep
arguments about,
rabbit holes there. Yep.
yes, you can. So, maybe it's a good thing I didn't go to law school, right? Because I think I'd probably just pull my hair out the entire time. Given the experiences that I've had over the last 3 years, and many Canadians, you know, um,
But it's simpler than you think. So, like our Western democracies are unique in that they were founded on Christian principles. Both
mhm,
our criminal law and our civil law. So, I like to tell the story, or at least I told it in an opening. It's been kind of surprising how one of the problems is we've gotten away from our philosophical rights. But for those of you don't know the second commandment, um, so the when Jesus was there, it was a rule-based society. In fact, started with Moses and the Ten Commandments. You're not to
mhm,
murder, you're not to steal, you're not supposed to commit adultery. There's long things that actually we take for granted as part of our moral code. But it had become so legalistic that it was just oppressive, and the religious leaders had all this power, and it was oppressive. And here you got Jesus walking around talking about the law in a way that wasn't oppressive but was
mhm.
actually freeing, and people were flocking to him. I mean, it was a problem. He actually couldn't go anywhere. He'd have to get in a boat and cross the, a waterway just to get away from people, and it was driving these religious leaders just crazy. And then all these rumors getting back to him that he's healing people and all of that. They just had to get rid of this guy. So they wanted to trick him. We've got all this complicated rule-based system. Well, we're going to ask him, what's the greatest commandment? And it doesn't matter what he says. We're going to be able to trap him in a legal argument and show the people that he's really not as clever as they think he is. So they go up to him and teacher, what's the greatest commandment? And he sees the trap right away, and he says, well, it's to love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your might and all your soul. And he could have just stopped there. They can't argue. They can't argue with that. He's exited the trap, right?
Mhm.
Understand? He's exited the trap, but he decides to go further. And he says, and the second commandment is to love your neighbor like yourself. And he says that's the entire law. Like, so you take, don't murder, don't steal. The whole thing is just love your neighbor like yourself. And loving your neighbor like yourself just means you treat your neighbor like you want to be treated. Now that's societies and Western liberal democracies used to be based on those two commandments. Now, if you're in a society where we each are trained and it's ingrained in us and we enforce it legally to treat each other like we want to be treated, well, now you're free from murder because you're not murdering anyone and nobody's murdering you because you don't want to be murdered. You're not being stolen from and you're not stealing from people because you're not going to steal from your neighbor and your neighbor's not going to steal from you. You don't have failed marriages because you're not going to sleep with somebody else's spouse because you don't want your spouse sleeping with anyone else. Like it decomplicates things. And so our legal system doesn't have to be complicated. It just gets back to first principles, right? And I mean, our civil law, there's a famous jurist, Lord Denning in the UK, who, totally had a huge impact on our tort law. And I mean, it was a famous case where he just says, well, who is your neighbor?
Mm.
Well, I mean, he's referring to the second commandment and the parable of the Good Samaritan, like full stop. I'm just making the point
Right.
that our system was based on certain principles, and the most free societies in our history have been those based on Christian principles. So, we've really done ourselves a disservice when we've turned it away from treating our neighbor like ourselves, and it's everyone for themselves.
I want to kind of switch gears just a little bit and ask you, because I know some of the viewers, because I brought it up. I brought it up, and I know some of the viewers may be wanting me to take this a step further and ask you, Bill of Rights versus the Charter of Rights.
Mm-hmm.
My personal opinion, and I could be wrong on this, from what I understand, the bill is a federal Bill of Rights. It applies to federal
Yep.
cases where it involves the federal government. Doesn't apply to the municipal level or the provincial level. And my understanding is that in the day, it was felt that it just didn't have enough teeth. It didn't go far enough.
Well, I guess that depends on who you are, but like the
Yes.
charter, it
Mhm.
disappointed. So the Bill of Rights was
Mhm.
brought in by the Diefenbaker government in the 50s, and I forget what year, let's say
Mhm.
57. I'm just taking a guess, right?
Mhm.
And if you read the Bill of Rights, it's actually very similar to the charter,
Mhm.
right down to, life, liberty, and security of person, like we have in Section 7. But the Bill of Rights went a little further and also protected property rights, which was interesting.
Mhm.
And it has a primacy clause, much like Section 52 of our Constitution Act of 1982 says the
Mhm.
Constitution is the supreme law of Canada. So the Bill of Rights said, listen, this bill takes precedence over all other federal statutes. And it's just the courts that, just like they have with the charter, and it would be the Department of Justice, this machine arguing in court
Mhm.
again and again and again to whittle it down, and it's become largely meaningless. But, one thing it did is before the Bill of Rights, if you were a First Nations person in Canada on a reserve, you couldn't leave your reserve without written permission
Mhm.
from the Indian agent to leave the reserve, and the Bill of Rights ended that. So it
Mhm.
did a tremendous service to our society in ending, what is one of the most shameful government policies we've ever had. So
Mhm.
so hats off to the Diefenbaker government for at
Mhm.
least ending that.
Well, I know also, Keith Wilson had raised the Bill of Rights as one of the arguments in the
Mhm.
Peckford mootness case as well. Like they went at it from multiple different vectors to try to get it through into the judge's mind, and what was what they were arguing for. But from my point of view, and I think a lot of people feel this way. Um, and I've been very reluctant to advocate for, um, Bill of Rights, Charter of Rights, any of these rights. I've been primarily sticking to the Charter. The reason being is that my feeling is that it doesn't matter what legal framework we're using in the courts right now if the police and the judges and the government trample all over it anyway.
Mhm.
So you could have the most glorious legal framework ever produced by mankind. But if the courts and the police don't respect it, and if the politicians disregard it, then, just by virtue of their disdain for the rule of law in their own country, it doesn't matter what framework you're using. And that's why I've been very reluctant to sort of advocate on any other, in any case. But I'm not a lawyer, so I don't have to really, parse my words very carefully when I'm, out, because I don't do legal cases. I meet with lawyers, I talk to lawyers, but I get asked these questions very often. Um, Strangely enough, the number of times people assume that I am a lawyer is kind of baffling. But I've repeatedly said no. I'm an army guy turned software developer. But I think it's people see me hanging around with Keith Wilson and Eva, they just assume I'm part of their club, which I take as a compliment. But I think ultimately if the courts and the police and especially the politicians don't respect the legal framework we're in, then I would almost say that that in itself is kind of a moot case. And I'm kind of
No,
curious to know what you think about it.
no, well, I mean, absolutely. That's what we just experienced. Listen, I'm 57. When I was a kid, if you saw a police officer walking down the street,
Hmm.
you felt safe. You were
Yeah.
glad to see the police officer, you know. Um, and now the police are adversarial, and
Hmm.
that's largely a result of the war on drugs and these silly things like check stops and stuff like that, which don't make us safe at all. So like war on drugs, for example, you know, so that people couldn't have marijuana in their homes and stuff like that. The the Department of Justice lawyers managed to convince our top courts that it was okay to grant search warrants into people's homes.
Hmm.
Like our homes used to be sacrosanct. But this, you know, public evil of drugs, as if we can stop it criminally, and then, you know, as if we should even be defining it as a criminal problem. But now we've got the police going into our homes, and then, um, you know, check stops because of the dangers of drunk driving. Now we have police roadblocks, and that's just expanded and expanded. Now we have daytime police roadblocks in British Columbia, and like it's total police state stuff. And now the police are adversarial because they view us as the adversary. It's no
Hmm.
longer serve and protect. So let me tell you a story. I was going to Valemount on a sunny summer day from Kamloops with my family, and you know, up for court. I used to do circuit vice. Well, I still do circuit court there. It's really the only part of my law practice I've kept. There's about 5
Hmm.
court days a year. Um, and in the middle of the day, both lanes of traffic are stopped by a massive police roadblock that are checking everyone. This isn't commercial vehicles, this is everyone. And car after car after car is pulled over. And I'm glad my dad wasn't there. He was born in 39. And to
Hmm.
him, roadblocks are police state. And to the generation before him, like this idea that there would be roadblocks, you know, around Christmas time and New Year's Eve, that would be full on police state. They'd be horrified. But
Hmm.
you know, now my kids who are in the car, this is normal for them now. This is, and I had been free until then. Now I wrote a letter. I was so mad. I wrote a letter to the editor to the province in Vancouver, and they made it their letter of the week. They published it on Sunday. And I got a call from an ex-police officer who had, you know, had been a police officer for a long time, and he said the culture's totally changed. He said it used to be
Hmm.
serve and protect, and he says now, like the citizen is the enemy, and you know, the old guard we can't get out fast enough because we just can't tolerate the culture. So you see,
Hmm.
we've allowed our institutions to be turned against us.
Hmm. It's funny you mentioned the changes, and those changes have happened very rapidly. So shortly after COVID, I was introduced to a police officer who was only he was hired as a 20-year-old RCMP officer, and then he switched to he transferred out of the RCMP to a local police department. And he was only 10 years on the job when I met him, and he was shocked and absolutely appalled at the attitude of the new police coming in. I mean, this is only a
And
30-year-old
he's a
police officer.
young guy, and
He's a
he's
young guy. He's a young guy, and he was appalled at what was coming in and what these new police officers on the job and the attitude that they had. And he had learned that the hiring practices had been changed. And I talked about this recently with another guest in within the industry, and the medical industry, and it was a comment about Jordan Peterson saying that he made a statement that new doctors or doctors that are applying to law school coming in are being assessed on how compliant they are to authority. And the same thing in my discussions with this police officer. He was saying they're hiring people that will not push back against their supervisor. They're
mhm.
very compliant officers to authority. They do what they're told. They follow orders. And you would think that in humanity's history, that would not be something that you're hiring police officers who have to go out as a lone individual into the community and try to police a neighborhood. You would
Hmm.
want somebody with a high moral, individualistic personality that was mature and could make judgments, not was just a compliant person that followed orders, because we all know how that has turned out in history for humanity.
Yeah,
But
recent history.
yeah, read your history.
No, recent history.
yes, yeah,
Like
yeah,
the last three
exactly.
years.
Recently, yeah,
I mean, can you imagine arresting pastors in Alberta and ticketing protesters and being there
yeah,
taking photographs? Like really?
yeah.
That's somehow in the public interest. That's okay for you to do?
Yeah, I've had the pleasure of meeting Pastor Artur Pawlowski, and I saw him a couple of days ago in the GTA as well. And he just lost one of his court cases because of a speech that he gave during the Coots protest during the convoy. A speech that he gave, he was just actually convicted this past week. And I don't know that it's gone to sentencing or anything like that yet, but there's other things I think other dominoes I think the courts are waiting to see fall. But it baffles me to hear about people going into solitary confinement for worship.
How,
Under the it's ridiculous. I mean, is it Tim Coates,
yeah,
Pastor
yeah,
Coates at Grace Life?
Pastor Coach,
35
yeah.
days in jail. 35 days in jail for
Yeah,
keeping his church open.
because he was a man of integrity and he would not
Yes.
sign a bail document that would
Hmm.
prevent him from preaching Jesus Christ, because
Yes.
that's what he's
Exactly.
here to do. And
Exactly.
that and if every pastor had done that, and if every
Hmm.
pastor had refused to close their church, churches
Yes.
wouldn't have been closed.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that. And I have some friends that are pastors, and I've had the pleasure of meeting Pastor Hildebrand in Elmer, Ontario. In the courageous fight that he has had against the Ontario government and the police and the courts. A friend of mine, Krista Nagel, she's one of the co-founders of Frontline Nurses, Canadian Frontline Nurses, was recently convicted, has a $10,000 fine for attending Easter Mass.
Wow. So
And
$10,000. Like who
yes,
can who you can break into somebody's house, you can steal their
mhm,
car and you're not going to get fined ten thousand
yeah,
dollars.
because I think it was what the limits were set under the Reopening Ontario Act, which is basically the Ontario government's justification for locking us all down and having a slow drip of letting us back out of our urban cages. So she, with many others, attended church on Easter. And I believe that the fines were between $10,000 and $100,000, and she got hit with 10,000 plus administrative cost of an additional 2,500. She immediately requested an appeal, and she made a deal between her lawyers and the Crown prosecutor. The judge intervened and said, "No, you're paying the full $12,500 upfront before I'll even entertain you going to an appeal." Right. So now we have a judge in Ontario here who has deliberately taken steps to impair somebody's ability to appeal a decision. And let's go back to the original conviction. It was for going to church on Easter.
But you see, in the judge's mind, and here's the problem,
Mhm.
is to the judge's mind, this was a person in the act of civil disobedience
Mhm.
and putting people in danger, when the real danger is always the state having too much power.
Yes. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
what the real danger is the judge believes he or she is protecting society. That's
Mhm. Had they just foregone judicial notice, maybe, maybe some of these judges would have went, "Wow, that kind of doesn't make any sense whatsoever." But no, they all towed the line from my perspective. Um, again, I want to switch gears a little bit with a different question, because I had a great conversation about a month or so ago with Derek Sloan, and This is a national citizens inquiry, again, funded and led by the citizens. And you'll see where I'm going with this question a little bit later, hopefully. But why isn't the official opposition of Canada doing an inquiry of their own? And if they were to do one of their own, because I know they have a committee, some hearings that have been going on, but would the official opposition party of Canada have any teeth to hold the government accountable for what they're doing or what they have done?
Well, I mean, they wouldn't have the right to, you know, basically appoint a commission with subpoena power, for example, which is a limitation that the National Citizens Inquiry has. We can't force you to come and testify. Mm-hmm. And also because we can't force you to come and testify, what you say under oath is not protected because we put the witnesses under oath. So, I mean, if they defame someone or they lie or commit perjury, they can be charged. So that it's actually, you know, a higher burden for them to tell the truth in our type of inquiry. But what the official opposition would have is they'd have the mainstream media, because how could the mainstream media ignore the official opposition conducting an inquiry into the government action, whereas something like the National Citizens Inquiry, thankfully, because citizens are getting the word out just on social media, but the mainstream media is by and large totally ignoring us. So, you know, and why has it, like, the problem I've had is you tell me what party that was in opposition, either federally or provincially, that while all these mandates and lockdowns, were basically saying that this was unjustified and we shouldn't be pushing vaccines on people and we shouldn't be locking in their homes. Was there a single opposition party? Like, am I missing something here?
No. And so, I was looking for it as well. I was looking for it. Many people were looking for this. They were looking for the official opposition party to bloody well oppose.
Yeah, like, I mean, I have to be honest, like, you know, since 2008 and the Harper government, I've been totally in the political wilderness, and I try not even to follow politics. But wasn't the federal Conservative Party actually complaining that, you know, the vaccines weren't being rolled out fast enough federally? I've heard that.
Yeah, and that's certainly, you know, my understanding as well, because they were under Aaron O'Toole. And
I know. And then when we had the change of leadership, and that's when half of the caucus went on hunger strikes because we're vaccinating kids and they won't stand for it, right?
Yeah.
Oh, no, I'm making that up. Are they? Yeah. Is there any opposition party, provincially or federally, that is saying maybe we shouldn't be vaccinating children with these COVID jabs?
To my knowledge, I could not point to a single political party, mainstream or anybody from the uniparties, that I could point to right now and say that those or that specific party was a phenomenal supporter of protecting children and not having them partake in this experiment. I can't point to any parties. I can point to my own political party that I belonged to when I ran here, which was the reason that I even joined the party. You know, there are parties out there, but when you talk about the media, and believe me, I'm no friend of the legacy media, but you know, I know that the CBC showed up to, I believe, Winnipeg. They were there for a very short time, did probably their little hit piece. Well, no, that's not fair of me.
They actually did.
It was pretty good. It was pretty good.
I thought they did a fair job, right? I mean, when the media shows up in an event, they don't they don't necessarily have to put it in a favorable light and still be doing their job. So I thought it was
good too. Yeah, it was fair, and I guess I'm very jaded. I'm very jaded specifically towards the mainstream media, CTV, Global. Like, I don't trust them. If it was up to me, if I could pull the switch or press the button, yes, they would be defunded. All tax funding would cease immediately, and they would have to compete on the open market just like everybody else. But you know, I guess I was hoping that the official opposition of Canada could do more.
Mhm.
But my frustration, I have an extreme frustration with this unholy alliance between the NDP and the Liberal government for the simple fact that two reasons. One, I fully acknowledge I misspoke during my time at the Convoy, and I phrased a certain desire to have a meeting with political parties with us during the Convoy. And I didn't choose my words carefully enough, and they were interpreted by the media to be, that Tom wanted to, was not elected. The Convoy wasn't elected, but we demanded to sit down and form a coalition government with all the other parties, which was not true. That was not the intent. And I did walk it back the next day as soon as I understood the interpretation. But
Mhm.
what I was saying is, you guys, all of you other parties could come together and form a coalition. You're allowed to form a coalition, apparently, and, unify against what the government of Canada is doing to the citizens. And I was vilified for that in the media badly. And the whole time that was happening, and we were being vilified, I was personally being attacked on that. We didn't know that the NDP and the Liberal government had been working on a backroom deal already. They just hadn't made it public. They didn't
Mhm.
make their coalition public until long after the Convoy had been broken up. But here's the thing that upsets me. And maybe I'm somewhat naive, and well, definitely naive about this, but I am hypocritical to the sense that, in one sense, I'm calling for a coalition. Uh, in the other, I'm saying nobody elected a Liberal majority government. And Jagmeet Singh walked over and handed him basically the
Mhm.
ability to govern like a majority. Canadian citizens did not elect a majority government, but that's exactly what Justin Trudeau has. And if you don't believe me, just go look at all the voting records. The NDP get in line with everything that the Liberals want them to get in line with. And that's why a lot of the votes have come down in the past. The NDP just
You know,
basically propped them up. And it
Tom,
frustrates
the
Canadians
thing,
as well as me.
the thing I don't understand is like the NDP and the Liberals. I mean, they have to live in this world they created.
Hmm.
Like
Yes.
their families were locked down. They
Hmm.
they had to live through all this coercion and division and economic destruction. Like we have generations of kids that they're gonna they're gonna be behind economically and mentally and academically for their entire
Hmm.
lives. Like literally their whole lives. Like
Yes.
we're not gonna be kind of back to reset for 80 years, assuming that we don't
Hmm.
screw things up more along the way. And here we have you mentioned it at the Liberal convention, the suggestion that vaccines should be made mandatory.
Hmm.
And what I find so fascinating about that is okay, I can understand that if you were accepting the government narrative that we had this deadly disease and it was so bad we had to lose all our civil liberties, and the way out was this vaccine. Like the way out was this vaccine. Just ignoring that the logic that if it actually worked, then why would you care if anyone else got vaccinated, right? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, I get, I like, so but I get that, okay, people could go, yeah, no, I agreed with this one.
Hmm.
But what about the next time the government wants to force you, you agreed on this one. Oh, this was a good, I'm with this. But the problem is if it wasn't being coerced on us, you could have agreed anyway. You were free to agree. But what
Hmm.
about, when they want to impose it on you or your family and you disagree? Like this one you're
Yes.
worried about. Like, do people not understand the precedent? What I
Hmm.
mean, like, our government is the army going to be able to go door to door and like wrestle you down and stick a needle in your ass? Like,
Yeah.
is that the world you want to live in? Because that's what you just agreed to.
And I often make this same exact point to people when I'm in discussions with them. It's like, you're under the impression that I'm upset about what's going on because of COVID or because of an injection that I don't want to take. That is what you believe to be what my grievance is. That's not what my grievance is. My grievance is about the level of grotesque government overreach that
Hmm.
this does set the precedent for now, but also next week, next month, next year, next decade. In, everybody that opposes what we did at the Convoy, I always say at some point in your life, there is going to be an issue so important to you that you are going to be motivated to protest the actions and the overreach of the government. And guess what? You won't be able to, because you stood in the way of the group of people that went to Ottawa to put an end to the government's hubris and their illogical thinking that they have this supreme right to rule over Canadians as opposed to work for them.
Hmm.
And when you get that, when you understand, I don't talk to people about the experimental injection. I always try to frame it about the law, about the precedent that is being set, about what is going to happen in the future. This is about the law. This isn't about a chemical.
Hmm.
And so I try to take that perspective with people. And what I've been finding is that I get a lot of results from people that say, okay, that's an interesting perspective. I didn't necessarily look at it from that point of view. I was looking at it from the greater good, protecting grandma in society and stuff. It's like, yes, but do you now realize that we have laws that have been put into place to protect us from the government doing what the government just did? And yet those laws were all just
Hmm.
picketed and bypassed. So I find I get a lot of results in my conversations with people. They're more open-minded when it comes to talking to them about the law than it does about the actual
Oh,
participating in the
interesting.
inspire.
That's
Yeah,
a way to open the conversation.
yeah, that's how I approach it. I don't approach it from, hey, chemical bad, listen to Tom, good. Like, that's not the way I do it with people. I try to appeal to the logic, right? And I always talk about informed consent, and I explain informed consent is a two-part formula. You have to be informed. That's the part that you haven't been given, but it is your duty to give the consent. You shouldn't be giving the consent until you actually have the information to consent to, and that you can see people, the wheels start to kind of turn, right? Like, that's the approach that I try to take, and that's what I find has been the most
Hmm.
successful for me. Um, but it's interesting because I often get asked, how do you wake people up? How do I get through to my friends and my family, my coworkers? And at this point, I'm saying, I don't know that there's a huge point to it right now. What I think is, don't try to wake people up. Let them naturally wake up on their own, but be prepared to receive them. Be their neighbor. And they may never apologize. They never may acknowledge. They may never see that they treated you unfairly, or they never, will see the error of the decisions that they made. But if they do, don't turn them away. Accept them with open arms and kind of help them through the process, because I think the rude awakening is upon us soon, and it's going to hurt for a lot of people. So be there for them. Even though they weren't there for you, be there for them. And I'm not saying forgive or forget. I'm saying be the better person.
I would say forgive, but
Mm.
I'm amazed. Like, we're still living a lie,
Yes.
and like, not only are we living a lie, like, I've been calling a lot of witnesses at the NCI, and so
Mhm.
you have to interview them and prep them, and we've had a large number of witnesses back down because,
Mhm.
like, I've had literally witnesses saying, I think I'm going to get demoted at work or lose my job,
Mhm.
and back down, or I'm just worried about the family repercussions or the social repercussions. And this is like in April and May 2023 in Canada. Like, we haven't
Mhm.
been locked down for a year, and yet we're still living this lie. Like, we're still
Mhm.
living this narrative that the majority of the population knows isn't true.
Mhm.
And you can't say to her, come on, give your head a shake. This is just you really,
Mhm.
like, come on, let's
Mhm.
let's go. Like, we rather, we're still afraid of repercussions, and I don't know what the answer is. So I'm glad that you've got a way to kind of open it. But what frustrates me is we have real people hurting, like people that are vaccine injured. Like you, we're seeing person after person, and a constant theme is they're just treated like second class people in the medical system, because here we have this medical system that can't acknowledge that the vaccine causes injuries. And so there's this, I don't know if it's a subconscious prejudice or what, but they're being treated awfully. And we've got to solve these problems, and we
Mhm.
can, first of all, we have to treat them well, and we have to come up with protocols, like get our best and brightest people on it. But here we are, we can't admit that there's a problem, so we
Mhm.
can't solve the problem, and so we're actually causing more harm. And that's what's driving me so crazy is like you're saying, we're going to have that moment,
Mhm.
but the longer we delay it, the more harm we're doing. And it's like, I don't know. Like this is why we're doing the National Citizens Inquiry.
Mhm.
Is and let me just tell you an anecdotal story. Is there's there's somebody in my world that I could I could send them, anything, and they won't watch it.
We all
Okay,
know this person.
but that person's watching the NCI. And other people are telling me the same thing. Like, so the format is somehow safe. And like what the format, like you literally, if you have got viewers who haven't watched it, like even just go and watch some of the recordings, let alone the live ones. But I mean, we've got four commissioners up there, and they're doing their job. Like they ask witnesses questions and the whole thing. The witnesses are sworn, and then to
Mhm.
tell the truth, and then they're asked questions from the lawyers, and we interrupt and we clarify, and we're getting really good evidence. But for whatever reason, there are some people that will not watch anything else, but they will watch the National
Mhm.
Citizens Inquiry. So somehow we've found a formula that for part of the group that just will not accept anything is
Mhm.
is willing to watch. And
Well, you know what? Perhaps because it is known as a citizen-led initiative, that just by virtue of who is putting this on, it's removing the perception that it might be biased in some way, that there's this overall agenda, and
well,
I think that that's very appealing.
we are being criticized as being too anti-government,
Mm.
um, and I have to share, like, because the problem is well, it's not a problem. The commissioners are independent, and so
Mhm.
their letter or whatever it is, setting out, they have to follow the rules, and the rules don't allow us to dictate at all what is in the report, and they have to rely on the evidence, etc. But the people that have applied to be witnesses, by and large, are going against the government narrative. And
Mhm.
so, you watch the hearings, and it really is coming out as anti-government, even though that wasn't our intention. And we send summonses out to the public health officers and ministers of health and all of that. Like, we want them to come and tell their side, but they're not coming. And interestingly, we're getting replies, and very polite replies, that saying we're not going to come. Um, and so, despite our best efforts,
Mhm.
the evidence really is kind of overwhelmingly anti-government, and it's just the way that it's going. Although it wasn't the intention
Mhm.
um, for it to be that way, but it is, and I don't know what else we can do. Like, one thing we can do, like you mentioned, Keith Wilson had
Mhm.
cross-examined Celia Larenko. Well, we can take that affidavit, and we can
Mhm.
take the cross-examination transcript and make that part of the record. And we're intending on doing things like that so that the public has a record, the best record as we can put together, of what the government side is under with evidence under oath. Um, but aside from that, we don't know what else to do to try and get more balance so it doesn't appear so anti-government, because it's not our
Mhm.
intention. And yet it's just the nature of the people that are willing to come and testify.
Right, right. Well, you and I spoke before we did the recording. We were a little bit hesitant to kind of go down this road, but I want to talk a little bit about criticisms.
Sure.
Somebody, I'm no stranger to being criticized. And, so Preston Manning was involved in the NCI from, I think, very, very early on. He was advocating for this. He was a big supporter. He was heavily involved in the origins of the NCI, from my
Mhm.
understanding. And at some point, I believe he accepted a position within the Alberta government, doing something similar on behalf of the
So
Alberta
we're
government.
we're
But I could,
going to allegations of conflict of interest.
yes.
Oh,
So,
okay,
so
okay.
yeah. So this is, we're talking about criticisms, I suppose. And, somebody that I know and respect, somebody you know and respect, which is former Newfoundland Premier Brian Peckford. We've spoken about him already. He's been very critical of Preston Manning's involvement in the NCI because he took the position with the Alberta government in their separate inquiry. If you had an opportunity to sit down with Premier Peckford and go through this, what would you say to him?
Well, I mean, so first of all, I mean, I've had email discussions with Brian on this, and we're just going to have to disagree.
Mhm.
And and I am saddened that, like, because you frame this as a criticism of you know Preston's involvement, and
Mhm.
so perhaps we should discuss this. And I don't want to criticize Brian in any way because we can have different opinions
Yes.
and we can disagree. And if anyone is out there fighting the same fight that I'm fighting, then
Mhm.
no, 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 I don't want to go there, right? But
Mhm.
I can say, so remember I explained that, we had this group that got together to, okay, well, let's structure this, let's make this happen. And, Brian and some others came in and joined this nucleus. And
Mhm.
so Brian will know that, Preston never ran the NCI, just like Brian never ran the NCI. I'd have to go back and check because the group's kind of changed a little bit over time, like the group that kind of steers it. Let's say there were 10 or 12 of us. Like there's a quorum, and if we
Mhm.
disagree, then we vote, and it's one person, one vote. So now Brian ended up leaving before Preston, got this appointment. And as I understand the criticism, um, is that it's kind of twofold, but it's related. Is so that Preston taking this appointment is a conflict of interest. Okay, so meaning Preston has an interest that's in conflict with something. And then a related one is that, okay, well, the NCI is saying they set themselves up to be independent of government,
Mhm.
and yet because you've got one of your people on your steering committee that, one person, one vote, that somehow that's a conflict. Now, what's interesting is when Brian joined us, he joined with another person, and they were both involved in a specific freedom issue
Mhm.
together. And I considered that they were friends. And I actually didn't trust this other guy for a while because this other guy was a federal civil servant,
Mhm.
right? So if the issue is that we shouldn't have somebody connected with the government as a voting member of this steering group, it's kind of interesting that there wasn't an objection then. And I actually
Mhm.
didn't trust this person for the longest time, and this person gained my trust from their
Right.
action. Because you look at what people, not what they say,
Mhm.
what they do. And now I just view this person as, a freedom for freedom. But
Mhm.
so Brian has left the group, and and then, so Preston is approached by the Alberta government, by Danielle
Mhm.
Smith. And for those of you that don't know, Danielle Smith is the Premier of Alberta. And if you've seen her in the mainstream media, it's because she had the audacity to say, people that were unvaccinated were really treated badly. And the
Mhm.
mainstream media has just, you know, really attacked her for that. Well, she has set up a very limited inquiry just to look at, okay, what Alberta laws enabled the government to do what they did during COVID, and should we be making any changes to those laws? So that inquiry if it's even called that, I can't say. They're not calling any witnesses.
Mm-hmm.
They're just looking into the law. And so if you want to make any submissions, you just go to their website and say, okay, there's this law and there's this section, and here are my thoughts on it. So it's very narrow. And Preston was asked by the Alberta government to head that.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I think we all wish that it was a much wider thing, but it's the only example of any government in Canada, however limited, looking into a narrow issue.
Mm-hmm.
And my understanding is that when the Alberta was, so Daniel Smith asked Preston to do this, that he said, well, if I agree to do this, I'm involved in this NCI project, and you have to agree I can continue. Like, I'm not gonna stop doing this if they still want me involved. And the Alberta government said, okay, that's okay with us.
Right.
So you can lead our inquiry, and even though you're involved in a separate inquiry, that's okay with us. So then when Preston comes to the group, it's like, okay, I'm doing this. Do you want me to resign or do you want me to stay?
Mm-hmm.
And so we have a decision to make. And I can't speak for anyone else, and I don't even remember how the vote went, except the vote was, no, Preston, we're happy for you to stay. But
right.
My issue is, like I got involved because I just can't abide us jabbing kids with these
Mm-hmm.
vaccines. Like I think we're killing children in Canada. And so I actually distinctly remember, and it's just kind of how I operate, is are we stronger? Like, here's this initiative, we want to get the word out. I want parents to watch this and stop vaccinating their kids. So, I mean, in my mind, I just did a cost-benefit analysis. Is the NCI going to be stronger with Preston as part of us, one voting member, or are we going to be weaker? And I decided we were going to be stronger. Mm-hmm. And so we agreed. Like, there was a majority that agreed, yeah, you can stay. And I mean, at any time, Preston is, I'll leave. But it's kind of like, so if we've agreed, mm-hmm. and the Alberta government's agreed, like, I'm sorry, I'm trained in conflict of interest. Like, let's say I act for two co-accused, like there's specific rules and law. I don't see the conflict of interest, so I'm of a different opinion, and I accept that other people can look at it. And so one of our voting members has a connection to an Alberta government inquiry. Mm-hmm. Well, okay, if that upsets you, it upsets you, and if it doesn't, it doesn't. And the interesting thing is like I explained before, it's like, I don't even know 70% of the people that are working for the NCI as volunteers on all these projects. Like, mm-hmm. What is the NCI? So if you're going to criticize us, sure, criticize that small group that made a decision the NCI was stronger with Preston, but don't criticize the volunteers. You know, mm-hmm. We've had over 250 witnesses, and many of them, it's really traumatic to be taking the stand and their mm-hmm. risk. And you know, I don't know. I have never been so honored to be part of anything in my life, and like I just haven't. And the irony is that we are being criticized as being too anti-government, mm-hmm. and I think that is a valid criticism, even though we're not trying to be. So, mm-hmm. So I in no way mean to be critical. I just disagree, and mm-hmm. And there's different viewpoints, and I really think, I mean, I think we're at an inflection point that's really mm-hmm. exciting. So let me, because I kind of view this as positive. I've been involved in other issues in the past, and it's only when you're starting to make traction that you're attacked, like for whatever reason. And the NCI is getting traction, and we're getting attacked. And I mean generally, not just what mm-hmm. you brought up. So. And there can be misunderstandings, and there can be disagreements. You know, you can have a freedom group hold a 3-day conference, and a couple of witnesses are called that in the past, you know, said things that, you know, are publicly unacceptable on different topics. Well, are we going to criticize those groups? Like, help me out here. That's not helpful at all, right?
Right.
And we all know there's personal disagreements and we all know there's ego. But Tom, what's exciting is for the first time since the trucker movement, I think people are coming together again. And it's
Hmm.
there's freedom group after freedom group after freedom group doing things. Like there's real action right now. And the NCI, like we're blown away at just how it's resonated. And people are saying it's giving me hope. And there are people
Hmm.
that wouldn't watch other things that are watching. And like I actually believe that God's blessing it. And I
Hmm.
pray, God, please use the NCI as a light on the hill and just shine into the darkness so that people can see the truth. And I think it's happening. So my message for people is let's follow the second commandment. Let's treat each other how we want to be treated. Let's
Hmm.
understand we can disagree. And, you can look at what I just said and say, yeah, I'm unhappy. I wish every member of your group had no connection with government at all. And
You talk about the volunteers participating in it, but when you and I met in March for the first time, like face to face in Toronto, the day that I testified, I learned that you had also shut down your law practice, and you and your wife are traveling across Canada from city to city, and this is your full time, 100% focus right now.
yes,
And
it has
like that is an extraordinary
been.
step to have that level of conviction and make that kind of sacrifice. And it's funny because yes, I commend you for doing that, but it was almost my naive expectation that a lot of lawyers across Canada, because remember we were all in this together, would have done that. So you've set the bar pretty high, and I think there are other lawyers out there that have done taken similar risks in similar financial there's been similar financial consequences, but I mean this is a big one, that what you have done, to put your law practice on hold, and you and your wife are traveling all across Canada to hear all of this, because you and I think spent an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours on the phone prior to my testimony. So for every 250 witnesses, that's a lot of time that you're spending outside of the testimony, doing the phone calls and getting the statements
Right.
and
And
doing that.
if I didn't interview you, so and in fact, I use you as an example when I coach the other lawyers to really spend time interviewing witnesses. And I don't know if you remember, but you were down as an economic witness,
Hmm.
not to talk about the Freedom Convoy, which it was
Right.
why I kind of negotiated to get more time for you.
Hmm.
But you were talking about, um, you know, you're teaching at the college, and this email goes out
Hmm.
basically announcing the mandate. But it was well into the discussion where we got into that bit about, and so I just have to tell the story. So Tom's teaching at a college, and the dean of the college sends this email out to like over 200 people, like the faculty, basically saying we're going to be imposing this mandate. And Tom kind of replies saying, there's some legal considerations here, and shouldn't, inviting people that want to have a dialogue to have a dialogue. And then people started reply all, like, take me off your email list, take me off your email list,
Hmm.
take me off your email list. And then one person reply all said, can you not reply all, because I'm getting all these emails. And basically the person was frustrated getting all the emails. And then another person piped in and said, no, we need to publicly shame this guy. And
Yeah.
then reply all, take me off your list. And that just shocked me, because this public shaming is a form of violence, and it's reprehensible. And if we hadn't had that interview, that wouldn't have come up, and then I wouldn't have pulled
Hmm.
that out of you on the stand, and it was such an important piece of evidence. So yeah, no, it's just a crazy amount of work, and all the lawyers to date have been volunteers that have been doing this. And we're all just getting getting exhausted. I mean, as soon as we're off this, I've got to I've
Yeah.
got an interview with somebody who's on the other side of the world,
Hmm.
and it's going to be a long interview tonight. So
There. So I do want to go back to the morning I testified. It was March 31st, and you had your opening remarks that morning. And I've watched this video twice because I was sitting in the audience, and I was just absolutely captivated by what you were saying. And I have watched the video 2 additional times after that because I was like, I want to be able to regurgitate this. And what you were talking about was that the public, those who were abiding by vaccine passports, were almost bragging or posting on their social media that they had done this. But the point that you had made was that it wasn't about the checkpoints. It wasn't about the Vax Pass. It was about sending the clear message from the government.
Do you want me to explain
Yes,
that?
please, because I thought it was brilliant. It was incredibly insightful.
Well, and it's also important for people to understand what happens psychologically. So, so if you back us up in time, where we're locked in our homes, we're waiting for this vaccine to save us, and then the government starts imposing these restrictions, or are basically granting people that had their identification papers, their passports, the right to do certain things. So back up before COVID. So in Canada, if you wanted to go to a hockey game, if you wanted to go to a restaurant, just to use those 2 examples, you didn't ask for the government's permission. You were free to do that. And you knew you were free because there was no restriction. There was no ritual for you to go through to be able to go to your kid's hockey game or to go to a restaurant. Now, that's what freedom is, when there's no restriction on you. Now, people that got the vaccine passport and used it, because some people got vaccinated and they had the passport, and on ethical grounds they never used it. But if you use the vaccine passport, you were thinking, wait a second, I have freedoms that these unvaccinated people don't have. But you don't understand that actually you were going through a police state ritual. So to go to a restaurant, you had to basically show your identification papers. And where you were free to go to a restaurant before, now basically you had to go through this ritual where you showed your identification papers as a precondition for you being granted the privilege to go to the restaurant. So you understand, it was no longer a right where you could just go. You had to go through this ritual of showing your identification papers so that the state would grant you the privilege. And what that does psychologically every time is it reinforces in your mind psychologically that the state is your master, granting you a privilege, because you have to go through this ritual of showing your papers as a precondition to the state granting you a privilege. When police states had roadblocks in cities, do you think they really cared where you were going? They didn't care one whit, because they know where you live, they know where you're going home for supper and where you're going to sleep that night. It's the ritual reinforcing that you don't have the right to travel, that by showing your identity papers, going through this ritual for the state, then the state grants you the privilege. And it just reinforces every time you participate in that ritual, it reinforces that the state's your master and you are the servant. And you participated in this willingly. And now the government's going to come in and impose digital identification that we are going to have to show to access different things. And that's what you wanted me to explain, Tom. And I think it's important for people to understand that it's the ritual that's the danger, because it conditions you to be a servant, and it conditions you to understand very clearly that you don't have the right. If you have to show identification papers or go through any ritual to do something you used to be able to do, understand you're being conditioned to be in a police state.
And I had heard politicians all around the world use the word either permission or privileges. Mm-hmm. If you comply, we'll give you your privileges back. I mean, that to me sounds like a warden, not an elected official serving the people. And I take the point as well that there was such effectiveness in this ritual and in this message that people would go to their social media and brag about being better than those who were not granted back the privileges. And this is where a lot of the divide started to really, really take root in society, the us versus them. It's like, I got my privileges back. You don't, because you're not a team player, or you're, somebody with unacceptable views. And so, I think that, like, this point, this is why when I heard it, I was like, I need to go back and listen to this again. And I think people need to get that. Whether you were one of those people who did brag about getting privileges back, you can't now ever in the future kind of look back and make the argument that, hey, there's a Charter of Rights in this country, because we talk about it and we say, well, this is our earlier point, where the government, are they the arbiters of truth? And, are they the ones who truly give us our rights? Because they're running around and they've convinced half the public that, yeah, actually the government gives me my rights. I wasn't born a free person. And we've gone through this ritual. And so now when the government decides to take away my rights, I can earn them back if I get in line, if I behave.
You can be granted the privilege.
Yeah,
I mean, what's the difference between having to show your identification papers to get into a restaurant and, pre-Bill of Rights, a First Nations person's having to get a written permission from the government agent to go to the restaurant? Tell me the difference, because I don't see the difference.
Yeah. And it's difficult for me to reconcile the fact that the average Canadian can't see this glaring truth. So during your time, though, with, at the NCI, you've mentioned you've seen about 250 witnesses. What are the highlights? What are the ones that are the most shocking to you? The ones that really stand out for you?
So one is, and I forget her name, but she was in Saskatoon, and she was near the end of the day. I think she was near the end of the second day. And she was, well, it's funny. I was going to say she's a little old lady, but she came back the next day because I referred to her as that on my opening on the third day, and say, no, you refer to me as esteemed elder. So she was an esteemed elder who, she has COPD, so she can't wear a mask. Right. Like literally she, full stop. And I mean, what is she, late 70s, early 80s? Like she's not young. And she goes to the cancer clinic, and she is told that she has stage 4 cancer. So basically, a death sentence. And she leaves the cancer, or the doctor's office, or cancer, whatever. No, it was doctor's office or cancer clinic. And she says, I need to settle myself. Like she just got the news. She's got stage 4 cancer. And so she's like, I have to settle myself. I have to calm down. I need to find, some solace. So she goes into a cafe. She can't wear a mask for medical reasons. And the cafe starts going after her, and a fight ensues. And she's basically forced to leave the cafe. And then some radio personality picks up on this and starts, no, she goes home and she's so shocked. She kind of posts on Facebook her experience, and she goes to bed. And the next morning, there's just hater after hater after hater. There was this campaign organized by this radio personality to basically attack her. And she was just devastated. So can you imagine, you've just been told you have stage 4 cancer, and you go to a cafe because you just need to collect yourself, and you get kicked out because you can't wear a mask, and you can't. And then there's this hate campaign. There are times where you can't not weep. I mean, there's times after a witness, I can't talk, and I'm supposed to be talking. There's a camera on me and tens of thousands of people watching, and I can't talk because I'm so choked up. And it's crazy. Another one was Radina, who was part of the Solidarity movement. She testified in Red Deer. So the Solidarity movement in Poland, she was in there on the ground floor, And after the leaders were arrested, she explained, we kept going, and she explained it was a small movement.
Mm-hmm.
And the leaders are, she didn't say arrested, she had some other term, but the rest of the movement is taking care of the families and still trying to get the word out. And she got arrested for, and you know why she got arrested. Like, how can we tolerate people like this? She was
Mm-hmm.
distributing materials that went against the government narrative.
Yeah.
And a naval court sentenced her to 3.5 years in prison. And she served a year before she got out, and then she came to Canada as a political prisoner, thinking that she would be free here. And now she's worried that when she goes to freedom rallies and hands out druthers or common ground, that
Mm-hmm.
she could be imprisoned, because that's what she did last time. She's engaging in the same conduct. But she said, and this has haunted me, that people didn't support the movement until they ran out of bread. So they could not get here. They're living in a full-on police state,
Mm-hmm.
and they're paying the price in small numbers, and they can't get the masses out. And we know that as soon as the masses came out, it stopped.
Yeah.
Like, as soon as the masses of Canadians come out, it stops.
Mm-hmm.
But it didn't happen in Poland, and we're exactly the same. It didn't happen until the bread ran out. And
Wow.
our problem is by the time the bread runs out, and it will,
Mm-hmm.
are we going to be able to take to the streets?
To go back to your,
The government knows they have to have
yeah.
the cage door shut before the
Mm-hmm.
bread runs out. They watch and learn too.
Mm-hmm. To go back to your first example, I remember hearing a story. I was a really young soldier, and we were still in Germany, or the Canadian military was just pulling out of Lahr and Baden-Baden, leaving Germany. And I remember a story that one of the soldiers I knew had done a posting over to Germany, and he was recounting the story. This was common knowledge, where the Germans would tell their children that, look, if ever you're out in the country, or you're out and you see a house that has a Canadian flag on it and you're in trouble, go to that house. The Canadians will help you. And so throughout Europe, that was the reputation of at least the Canadian soldiers. Internationally, Canadians have been known as being kind and generous and very polite, and we apologize too much. And yet, very, very quickly, it is amazing to me to see how easily everything that we ever worked for to build that reputation, we threw out the window within virtually no amount of time whatsoever. In my own personal lesson in life, somebody asked me one day on social media and said, what did you learn about 2021? And my response was, what I learned in 2021 was that those people who I believed would have stood up to the Nazis in their indoctrination, turns out they actually wouldn't have. And I'm surprised, because there's people that I thought would have fallen in line actually didn't in the time of COVID. And so, when I hear those stories as well, because, when I was campaigning, or I would go to events, I'd go to rallies, I hear these stories. People come up to me, and it's very excruciating, to be honest, because I get to meet Canadians that supported the convoy, and in the moment that they meet me, they're presenting the very best versions of themselves to me, because they know who I am. Mm-hmm. But then the conversation immediately switches, where I am the audience now, listening to the worst things that have happened to these people since the time of COVID. So I get presented with the best of them and the worst of them in a very short conversation. And I feel like I almost feel obligated to somehow console them. And I don't know what to say. But if you talk to someone like Chris Barber, Tamara Leach, and any of the others that were involved in the convoy, Danny Bulford, they'll tell you the same thing. They hear the best and the worst of experiences that people have. And, you know, I often, if I publicly speak about things, I tell people, listen to your Eastern Europeans. Listen to them. They've been through this before. They're screaming at the top of their lungs to tell you what is going on. And you have to listen to them because they've lived this already and they're scared because they've been through it once, and they're telling you the parallels are identical. Listen to the Eastern Europeans. But, you know, how can Canadians right now support the NCI? And I don't mean donating financially. I mean, that would be great. I mean, what you're doing isn't free. It does cost money. I get that. But is there a way that Canadians could support you in the NCI right now through other means other than financial?
Well, actually, I think the biggest thing is actually getting people to watch, right? Like, I mean, I get that we've only got, you know, 2 more cities left, but we've already decided we're going to have to hold more hearings and do things. But we've got, like right now, we've been through 6 cities, so we have 24 full days of hearing. And I mean, we usually sit till about 6:30, 7 o'clock at night, just to make sure that we get through those witnesses that were scheduled that day. And you know, if you own a tire shop and you have a TV there, well, when we're sitting, live stream us. And if we're not sitting, why don't you just pick a day and let it run all day so that the people waiting in your tire shop are watching what's going on? Why don't you
That's
know?
brilliant.
Well,
That's an actual brilliant suggestion. You know, because you know, there are people sitting in waiting rooms all over the place, and yeah, I think that that's a brilliant suggestion. I mean, that's a way, in a very non-aggressive, neutral territory style, of having people learn something new in a non-threatening or aggressive way. I think that's a brilliant suggestion. You know, so I would put that challenge to any viewers that maybe own a business that have a TV in their waiting room. Put the NCI up on the screen. I think that's brilliant.
yeah, like I mean, what we need is we need to get to that point where we can stop living a lie and, you know, agree that what happened, and then start working together to help each other again. And you know, here we have a forum, like, and I mean, we've had the world best experts. We've had Canadian experts that nobody, you know, had really heard from before, that were just eminently qualified, and just the way they delivered their evidence is incredible. Like, I mean, I challenge everyone to go and watch in Saskatoon. I think it was, he might have been the first witness. Like, I know he testified as the first witness of the day, but he might have been even on day 1, Dr. Francis Christian. And listen to his testimony. And anyone can watch that man and his testimony and not feel threatened, but, you know, learn new things.
I met him at the Convoy, actually. Met him in person there. He did
attend. You know what I'm talking about. Like, this man is he's a deep soul, and he's a kind soul, and he speaks truth, and you hear it when he speaks. And so nowhere is there such a kind of body of testimony under oath collected anywhere. And you literally could, you know, business owners cycle through it. Like, I don't know, we got to run an extension cord and put your TV on the front lawn so people walking their dogs by see it. Like, somehow we just have to let people know of what's happening. And, you know, like, Tom, your evidence, it will change lives if people will watch it, right? And then we eventually will break it all up, so yours will. But I mean, right now, even if you're just streaming it with all the gaffes and blunders of a live event, who cares? So I mean, I think, you know, we talk NCI, we've even got we've got to rename it going forward, because there's more happening just because people have been inspired. So I mean, really, it's just figure out, you have to stand up. You have to understand that you don't have to be afraid anymore. That's an illusion. And actually, the cost of being afraid is too high. And so you have to figure out yourself, how are you going to bring our institutions back? and it'll come to you. If you just sit down for a full day and say, what can I do? All I'm doing is coming up with ideas. What is it that gets my goat the most? How do I change it? Like, this has to become everyone's priority so that their jobs suffer, their hobbies suffer. Freedom now, the price of freedom has gotten too high for you to wait any longer, or you won't be able to pay the price. But we can still do this, and
Hmm.
there's more of us than there isn't. Like, the weird part is we're the majority, but we're still acting in fear. And so I think we just have to realize that we don't have to pretend that abnormal is normal anymore.
Hmm.
And you know, um, most of us have felt at some point in our life that we were here for something important. Like, most of us have had that, and you nod your head, you know exactly what I'm talking
Hmm.
about. And then, our life got complicated and we had jobs and kids, and we would think, well, that was just a feeling I had. But no, that feeling was true. You
Hmm.
actually all are here for something important. And that something important is actually now. Like,
Hmm.
this is a point where actually what you decide to do or don't do is going to define who you are in a way you've never imagined. Everything's amplified. You can't
Hmm.
just carry on in your job and pretend it's okay, and think that it's an interesting time, Tom.
Yes,
Right?
it
Right?
is.
I mean, we've all read history and war, and well, we're in a war.
Hmm.
Like, it's an information war.
Hmm. Yeah, a friend of mine, Drew McGilvery from Veterans for Freedom, he's done a video. He's talked about this extensively, fifth generation warfare,
Hmm.
and it's all about information. And I know Robert Malone has spoken about fifth generation warfare. You know.
He testified at the NCI and did a
Hmm.
presentation on fifth generation warfare. And
Hmm.
what spooked me is when he's showing us Canadian news articles
Hmm.
about the military running fifth generation warfare campaigns on the Canadian populace. Like, these are news
Yes.
reports of what he's
Hmm.
talking about, and I'm going, okay, and yet Canadian citizens are just sitting down and doing nothing and eating popcorn in their home while they watch, I Love Lucy reruns.
Hmm.
And yet our media actually reported that our military was running psyops, military grade psyops on us.
Hmm.
Well, obviously it worked.
Yes. Yes, it did. And speaking of military, I listened to the testimony from retired Lieutenant Colonel David Redmond, and I'm familiar with everything that he had presented. He was speaking about for a couple of reasons. One, in my career with the military, I sat beside the equivalent or a representative from Emergency Management Ontario, so I
Hmm.
was familiar with them. And it was about halfway through last year when I was running in the Ontario election that, a conversation at an event we were doing, I realized people didn't know about emergency management organizations across the country. So I reached out to Colonel Redmond and I asked him for all of his information. He graciously shared it.
Hmm.
Veterans for Freedom did a briefing note on it, condensed all his information. We shared it across the party. We started talking about it in the Ontario party to share with Canadians. And I know we don't have a lot of time left because you've got other things that you have to attend to,
I
but
actually have to
yeah,
go
yeah. So,
interview a
but
witness.
I would just encourage people to go back and watch the testimony. And I believe it was last Thursday or Friday of the previous week. It was incredible. It's
Yeah,
the
he was
best
he was in
presentation
Red Deer, and so just so
in
you
Red
know,
Deer. Yes.
if
Hmm.
you watch him in the morning of
Hmm.
that day, we also called him as back as the last witness. So you'll see
Right.
that for scheduling reasons, I had to cut him off,
Hmm.
but we had him come back as the last witness, and some of the things he said at the end of the day were as
Yeah.
incredible as what he said at the beginning of the day. And
Hmm.
that actually, I think that's mandatory testimony. Like, we'll eventually put the
Yes.
two pieces together and just publish it.
Hmm.
But,
Hmm.
Sharon might volunteer, and
I I
we'll
thought
get.
about I thought yeah because I believe in so much of what he said, and from my own experiences with the military, I understand the operational planning process that he talks about. It's used by the Canadian military. I understand exactly what he's getting at in the processes he was describing and the way it should have been. But
Mhm.
from my perspective, I look at it and I think there's no possible way that every provincial government and territorial government in this country, including the federal government, could be that incompetent where they all came up with the same exact idea to throw their emergency management organizations to the sideline. From my perspective, and yes, it's an accusation, but I believe it was done intentionally in this country. And for whatever reason, I can't comprehend why. I don't know if there's any real pushback from the emergency management leadership to the politicians. And anyway, I'll save that for a separate issue because I
But
do know you have to go.
can I just
Sure.
clarify so your viewers understand what you're saying? So
Yeah.
both federally and in every province, there's an organization to deal with crises that arise, including pandemics, and it's not public health. So
Hmm.
this organization, they are the experts, and they will have handled previous pandemics. And you don't give the public health officers control over your rights and freedoms and economy. This group, and they had even, every province would even have a pandemic plan, and public health is just one agency that gives them advice, but
Hmm.
they consult with a wider range and make decisions. And basically every pandemic plan we did in every province, we threw it out, and in every province the organization that was supposed to manage the pandemic was sidelined and public health officers took over. And Tom's saying, how can it be that every province did the same thing, which basically wasn't supposed to happen? And
Hmm.
just so you know, every pandemic plan, we did exactly what we weren't supposed to do.
Exactly.
And
Yes.
how can it be that 100% of the provinces do the exact wrong thing and all do it?
Hmm. The Canadian military had something called Operation Laser. I know about it because it was my job to review it every year as part of our domestic response to our responsibility to supporting the public. Every fall, the Canadian military looks at its domestic responses, its contingency plans. The Canadian
Hmm.
military has Operation Laser, which is the contingency plan to handle a pandemic, should we be requested by the government of Canada to intervene. Even the military had plans for this, and yet nothing. So I'm going to leave it there because I do know
Yeah,
you've got to
it's
go.
been a long time.
Yeah, it has. But you've been extremely generous with your time, not only with us and the viewers, but also with the NCI. So thank you so much, Shawn, for everything that you've been doing. And thank you for sharing some of your insights and your experience here with us in this interview. I really sincerely appreciate you taking the time to be with us. So thank you.
Well, Tom, really appreciate what you do and getting to know you. So
Thank
look
you.
forward to standing with you going forward. So,
Great. Awesome. It's really been a pleasure, Shawn. Thank you so much.
okay, take care, Tom.
Okay. You too.